Hello and welcome back to Others of Harbour. It is April now, so we're going to cover the books read in March, right over here. So, physically very large, but these weren't super long. I did find this month, so my sleep hasn't been the best, and sometimes when I'm a bit tired, I can start dozing off when I'm currently reading, and if I'm good and diligent, I will go back and reread the parts that I might have missed, but sometimes I do create this strange half dreaming vision of what I've just read. And this may have happened with some of these books because looking back, I don't fully remember the exact details of a lot of them, so I had to flick back a little bit just to make sure I am talking about the right kind of thing. But just starting with Sons and Lovers, this was a really tough read. So this was the first novel that I read this month, and it took me about 12 or 13 days to get through. It's not super long, but it is also... It's chunky. It's about 500 pages of modernist realism, which is not always the most engaging style of writing. D.H. Lawrence is an author who is very interested in relationships. In fact, this is for the category with love in the title. And D.H. Lawrence has 3 novels that could meaningfully fit that category. He's got Sons and Lovers, Women in Love, and Lady Chatterley's Lover. Lady Chatterley's Lover was a novel that I read, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, and I quite enjoyed because I was really surprised at how candid it was about relationships and how much emotion it imbued into its characters. And Sons and Lovers doesn't quite meet that expectation. So I surprised myself by liking D.H. Lawrence. I had previously assumed, just based on the idea of this late Victorian era, early 1900s male writer about relationships, that I just wouldn't find his writing compelling. And I think Sons and Lovers were the kind of novel that I was afraid of. So it's such an analytical novel about men and how they choose their relationship partners, what kinds of beliefs and values they may have. And it's just not that kind of really engaging, fiery novel that I found Lady Chatterley's Lover to be. And I think maybe what it is that D.H. Lawrence really wants to write about sex, kind of within that modernist context and being realistic about what relationships are like. He wants to break free of puritanical, or at least kind of socially conservative movements to keep novels very free of the messiness of relationships, because I think this man loves a messy relationship, but he doesn't go as far as you might assume so here. I think it's interesting because this book even does have sex scenes, but the way that they're presented, they're really held back from actually talking about what physically happens and what the characters feel about it. And instead, what we're left with is this very judgmental voice of this author. So he's presenting the story of a young man who is raised by a working class family. His mother devotes herself absolutely to him, and it results in this kind of Oedipal relationship where the son feels so indebted to his mother and his mother's values that every woman that he tries to be with, there's 2 women primarily that this novel's about, that he just can't seem to connect with them, and he seems to treat them so cruelly compared to his mother. He's so dismissive. He doesn't respect their intelligence or their personality. He views them as almost kind of detriments or poisons to what he really wants in his life. And he doesn't really know what he wants in life. What I find interesting too in this book is that, in line with that 1900s context, it is about a working class family that has a middle class son. And so we have this young man going into this office job and being completely bewildered by a very different attitude towards work than what he's seen from his father. His father is someone that works in the mines, goes drinking every night, and comes back home just yelling and in terrible emotional state, but also barely at home all the time because he's so busy with physical labor. And the son is just completely distant from that, doesn't experience that at all. And this is an interesting story, especially because I feel like even in our current context, we have lots of those examples of working class families and middle class children, that I wanted to see more of that, and I didn't get that. And I wanted to see more of the emotional side of the relationships, and I didn't get that. And ultimately what I got was this young man treating women really poorly and having this Oedipal excuse, which is interesting, I guess. Like, if I had to think about it in context, I do find it really fascinating that this novel is written and published just 3 years after Freud coined the idea of the Oedipus complex. So it is a novel that's rooted in, for what was then, kind of very current theories. But it does need you to read it within the lens of that, because to read this novel for enjoyment, it's just not enjoyable. I think it just presents such a bleak and emotionless view of relationships in this world, and it doesn't give its characters any joy or forgiveness. Instead, it's just sad, but like not in a poetic or aesthetic way. I would give it a. So my experience, it would be a 3 out of 5. I know this book is a classic, and I know people talk about it all the time, but I don't know if it holds up so much because society has moved on, relationships have moved on, attitudes towards men and women have moved on. It's worthwhile to think about how people viewed men and women back in the day. But even, I would think back in the day, surely people would have seen Paul Morell and gone, this guy sucks, this guy's so mean. Book number 2 for my first line game, Neuromancer by William Gibson. A first line so iconic that it is on the back of the book's cover. I can't read it off that. The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. So this is one of the most famous cyberpunk novels written of all time. It is a book that really codifies how it feels to read cyberpunk. We have this idea of internets and hacking and jacking into things. We have biological augmentations, big giant corporations and shady actors, conspiracy theories, very, very dark and violent themes. This kind of noirish overtone as well, where we have characters pulling off heists and making big jobs and teaming up with very diverse casts of characters, travel all around the world and to try and do jobs in which they have no real personal agency, but do reveal huge things about the big players of the world, whether it is organized crime or corporations or politicians. I just think it's a very interesting subgenre, and I think that a lot of cyberpunk today is just kind of cosplaying. Like, yes, its themes are really important, but it's also such a aesthetic. It's such a stark and recognizable way of presenting things with all the neon lights and the synthwave music, and it's cool. Like, I think despite the fact that cyberpunk is such a politically and socioeconomically charged genre, it is also just super, super cool to imagine this future that in some ways is kind of like what we have today. Like, the internet is so pervasive today. We're so close to the kinds of technology that this book is predicting, but at the same time, it's so different. This book's view of the internet is from the 1980s, and it views the internet as this sprawl, as this kind of physical interface that someone who hacks and decks is what this novel uses, is kind of like they can connect themselves to the internet and then walk around in this physical space like a metaverse. And we all know how the metaverse went. That's not how the internet is like anymore. So how can you read this book other than a sort of fantastical alternate reality history? Well, if you do that, then it's super fun. It's a lot of fun. And I think what I like about this first line, going back to the category topic, is that it's often a faux pas to start a novel with a description of the sky. Like, it was a dark and stormy night, historically is made fun of as one of the worst opening lines you can have. And having a line like this, to me, suggests that the novel's going to care about setting, and the novel's going to care about mood. It is very intent on presenting a world that's really different to ours, and it's one of those opening lines that I would fit in a similar category to something like 1984's Was a Bright and Cold April Morning and the Clock was Striking 13. Kind of, at the very beginning, you don't get a character, you don't get a plot, you don't get really anything other than a visual image of the setting and this emotional state that you're supposed to be in. The color of television tuned to a dead channel is both kind of nothing, especially today, now that we don't even have analog television signals. Like, does anyone actually know what that looks like anymore? Or, I mean, like, how do I access that kind of image? And yet, at the same time, it's poignant on a subconscious level. It's something that makes me think about a world that is grayed out and is, at the same time, very noisy and very quiet. You don't know where meaning is. And so that's what we end up following. We follow Case, who is this hacker who has been kind of chemically damaged to the point that he can't use his abilities anymore. And he is drawn into this heist in order to find this rogue AI called Wintermute. The way we think about AI, the way we think about internet, the way we think about all of these things is very different now. But I would also think that a lot of the way that we've designed the internet and designed AI has a lot to owe to the way we thought about it first through fiction and through something like Neuromancer. Neuromancer is not the first cyberpunk novel, and I would argue the genre goes way, way older. Like, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is from the 1950s. But this book makes you see that future the most vividly. And that's what I really enjoyed about it, is that it is this very singular, cohesive vision of setting that as we are going through these heists and as we are trying to find this rogue AI, as we just watch Case work and watch how he solves problems, watch how sometimes it's the use of physical violence and sometimes it's the use of technology, and it's constantly changing. There are all these problems. It gives us this really rich view of the world that is very multicultural. It goes across so many different continents and languages. It is very imbued within this East Asian aesthetic, because I guess, imagine in the 1980s and 90s, you view East Asia, Chinese and Japanese aesthetics as being more futuristic than what was available in America. But also that sense of exoticism is something that is disorientating to the reader. We always are placed in this situation where we don't really know what's happening. We don't really know who's has the cards in their hands, who has the power in any given scene, and what any character is really capable of. Because so many things are available, because there is AI, because there are biological augmentations, we don't know who is dangerous, we don't know who is trustworthy. And that sense of paranoia, I think, is really emblematic of novel writing in the 1980s, and all of that I think is just very palpable in Neuromancer. It makes this a really, really rich and valuable text to understand what life would have been like then, and to understand what they thought the future might have looked like too. The good things and the bad things about humanity, and the very bad things. This is quite a pessimistic science fiction text. Overall, I enjoyed it. I think it's the singularity of the vision that really works for me, even as the overarching plot. If you just view it as a heist narrative, it's not the most exciting, because it does sometimes get bogged down in explaining the details, or also little side quests you're not really sure what they mean, or also just uncertainties. Like, sometimes you need stakes in a heist story. You need to know what character they're capable of and what they're not capable of, and that's just not as clear in this book, where some characters are capable of so much and some aren't capable of anything, and there's just a bunch of techno-speak to explain what does and doesn't work. That can sometimes be disorientating to the point where I don't feel the tension of the story anymore. But aside from that, if I can follow along, then I still really enjoyed it, and there's so much to talk about with this book here. I would give it a 4 out of 5. I really enjoyed reading it. I do know that there are 2 books. It's so funny. So it's a trilogy, but it was originally written with the intention of being a standalone. Am I going to read the next ones? I don't know, but we'll see. But so far, this is pretty enjoyable. We'll talk about loose ends. King John by William Shakespeare is the last Shakespeare in history that I need to read before I've done all the histories, and then I've got just 4 more plays, and then I've finished the whole collection. King John I thought I would dislike because it's one of the least known Shakespearean histories, and the histories for me have been the least favorite of the genres. But I really like this. I think maybe it's just because I've read all the other ones, so I know what to expect. I know what's going to be good and what's going to be bad. But it's also just setting-wise really different from, I guess, the main 2 series of Shakespearean histories, the Henry IV plays and the Henry VI plays, all kind of take place in these 1300s, Year of the Roses type settings, where everyone's really obsessed with birthright and whether they get to keep control of France, and all of that's like, it's fine, it's whatever, right? And by virtue of just being a little bit different, King John is set in the, I believe, the 1100s, and the king in question is historically known to be a tyrant, like the one that was such a bad ruler that the peasants revolted and created the Magna Carta that forced the king to sign it, otherwise they would just depose him. That's the King John we're talking about here. And yet this play is not at all about the Magna Carta. This play is about, again, the right to rule over France. In fact, this is a period of history where the British Empire had its throne in France, and in what is modern-day France. And so we start this play with a dispute over who is the rightful ruler of England, whether it is King John or whether it is a nephew or a grandson from a different half of the family. And I've previously complained a lot about birthright narratives. I think they're not very interesting when we just have characters debating over who deserves to rule based on who their parents were. But I think this one kind of avoids that problem by being really about what King John himself tries to do to prevent the birthright narrative from ruining his right to rule. And so we have this character who is not a good person, but we see him acting out of self-preservation, and we see how he still has a bit of humanity in himself. He still is trying to assess how much bad stuff is he willing to do in order to keep himself in power, and also is the bad stuff that he does going to make people defect from his side? Is he going to lose the support of the French and the English and the general people? I find it so interesting that the two factions at the very beginning of the play in Act 2 are about to fight, and so they each go to this French village and tell them, hey, we rule you guys, so if you pledge loyalty to us, we'll go away, but if you don't, then we'll come in and destroy you. And the villagers basically say, well, we don't really care. We serve the king, and if you guys can't figure out who the king is, then you go fight in that field over there until you know. But we're not going to be involved in this at all. And I think that's just so funny. I really enjoy this view of Shakespearean history play where it's not just about the kings and who's going to be king. Ultimately, instability affects the average person, the person of the kingdom. And having this little town debate here really shows the stakes of what this play is eventually going to be about. We have characters who are in the royal courts, but they're really split between the roles of being representative of a certain political faction and also a human being. Like, if you feel unstable or if you lose a family member, if it's because of these political machinations, you're still going to feel real human emotions about that. And I think there's some really poignant speeches in this play brought on by that people take off their masks of being a politician and they reveal themselves as human beings. They feel grief, they feel remorse, they feel moral uncertainty at doing things that politically make a lot of sense and yet personally don't really align with the values they personally uphold. I think this makes for really, really interesting storytelling, and I like that this is self-contained and standalone. The characters are not as complicated, kind of web-like as the later Shakespearean histories. I just think overall it's a good play. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think it's underrated. I think it's like top 10 Shakespeare plays, and I've never seen anyone talk about it or perform it. So yeah, it's a 4 out of 5. It's really, really enjoyable. Rule of Cool, Smart Ovens for Lonely People by Elizabeth Tanto. I know that the category is for cool people, and this book is for lonely people, but it's also very, very cool. It is a collection of sort of magic realist, sort of sci-fi short stories by a Western Australian writer. And what I just find really funny is that going to the contents page and looking at the list of stories, you see it and you think just, what's going on in here? There's a lot of stories for a fairly short book, but some of the story titles, a girl is sitting on a unicorn in the middle of a shopping center. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. This is not a treehouse. And Lola Metronome and Calliope St. Laurent having a picnic at the end of civilization as we know it. And you put the U in Utopia or the last Neko Atsume player in the world. You read a title like that and you think, I want to know what that is. That's such a alluring kind of hook into whatever the story could be. Like, you don't know what it's going to be about, but you know it's going to be a bit surreal and uncertain. And I think that's what I like about each of these stories, is that I read it and I think, wow, that's a real, like, I could give this to someone and say, this is a lot of fun. I think you would like this concept. And it is just a way of storytelling that's just very shareable, very immediately accessible, and high concept-wise is just clever in its representation of modern life, but also points towards this kind of deeper human poignancy and longing for connection. So I wouldn't go so far to call this book satire. I think it is making fun of modern life, capitalism and internet culture and inner city kind of suburban and city relationships. But comparing it to a book like Portable Curiosities, which I also like very much, Portable Curiosities is dark humor, and it often ends with very brutal images that doesn't do much more than kind of force out this wry laughter at how cooked everything is. And Smart Ovens for Lonely People, to me, is a little bit more hopeful. It's a book that does still believe in little human interactions being tremendously meaningful. It believes in affection, it believes in family, it believes in little routines and habits and meaning in lots of these small things, and yet it doesn't shy away from really heavy topics like depression and like cycles of neglect and distrust. I think variously these stories about characters that are hollow or incomplete in some way, and they are searching for answers in increasingly absurd situations. And yet, despite all that, there is still humanity. There is still something really delicate in a lot of these stories that I quite enjoy. And the way that all of this is kind of tied together, all these little contradictions, in just very fun high concepts, it's just a very enjoyable read. And it's something that I think when I talk about books for cool people, I think about books that I would like to share with others, that books I would like to be seen reading and to say, hey, this is something that I really enjoy and I want to talk about. In contrast to something like Sons and Lovers, where the whole time I was reading on the train being like, I hate this, no one talked to me about it. Smart Almost Lonely People, very shareable, please do pick it up, it's just really, really great. I gave it a 5 out of 5 just from how much I enjoyed every little story. Like, it's not perfect, but it is also so memorable and so delightful. Just the fact that I could be reading this and smiling to myself and not even realizing that, I think that's a fantastic thing. Booker Prize winner, The Promise. This book is okay. It's set in South Africa and it is about a family of white South Africans that have this black housekeeper named Salome. And these white South Africans are variously trying to, I guess, hold on to their previous wealth, and after the end of apartheid and changing social conditions in South Africa, the younger generation are a bit more compassionate than the older generation, and they have to navigate this idea of being inheritants of a wealth that was really, really not deserved. Like, a lot of cruelty was enacted in South Africa's history for this white family to have the house and to have the stability that they have. And so later in the novel, we have these younger characters grappling with ideas of security and safety, of reparations, and whether it is moral or correct for them to enjoy this cushy and comfortable lifestyle, or, in the state of this character named Amor, whether it's more correct for her to go into some kind of compassionate field, to be a nurse, to abdicate some of her wealth, and to make good on the promise that, on the will of one of these older characters, they asked for the house to be left to Salome. And this couldn't be done when the person who passed away did so, because back then the laws of apartheid meant that black South Africans could just not own that property. And now that, in the setting of the story, they can, will that promise be met? Will that promise be upheld? And does it even mean the same thing anymore? Like, is it a compassionate thing to leave this house to Salome? Or is it just something being done to quell the conscience of the white people that don't feel comfortable having wealth, and yet still do? And this is one of those really wicked problems where, at the end of colonialism, you can't just leave and pretend that everything's going to be okay again. After someone's been hurt, or after an entire people group have been hurt, it's really, really not easy to heal. And how you go about that healing is a long and answerless problem, because there's going to be periods of instability. There's going to be huge amounts of inequality and violence and injustice that breeds more injustice. And it increasingly is not really a conversation about morality anymore than it is a question about, well, what is society going to look like? And who are the people that are going to lead and to make decisions that are meaningful for everyone? And so to have a very personal story like The Promise, and have it end in this note of, well, we don't know anymore. We don't know what's right. We don't know if there is an easy way out. I think I do feel the difficulty of being in this kind of situation. And having been, I think, the third South African novel to win the Booker Prize, the first two were both by J.M. Coetzee. It's fine. It's okay. I don't personally love this theme of white guilt because it's so prevalent amongst the Booker Prize winners, and emotionally and structurally, I think this novel is also just fine. It's not the most experimental. It does kind of flit through the characters' heads, and it reminds me a lot of William Faulkner's style of writing, where something like The Sound of the Fury, he is going through all of these different characters' heads in order to show different attitudes towards a very, very similar theme to the Southern Gothics, inheriting wealth that is ill-gotten, and then what to do about it after you have it. It all felt a bit familiar to me, but it didn't really sweep me away like other books I've read that do a similar thing have. So I would give this a 3 out of 5. I think of the Booker Prize winners, not that I've read a lot of other books that were published this year, but I would be surprised to think of this as the best book that came out this year. I think it's very successful in what it's trying to do, but there's also just so much more greatness amongst contemporary literature and also Booker Prize winners that I would have trouble putting this towards the top. I'm getting more and more ashamed that all the South African literature I've read, which is just 5 or 6 books, but still, it's all by white authors. So I would be interested in reading more from black South African authors as well. I will need to do my research to do that and probably put that in the loose ends category. I think to be a more responsible reader, I need to diversify than what all these prize winners are telling me to read. For French canon, The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux is fine. It's this mystery story, and it's gone on to be so famous and so well known through the films and the opera. And reading the original novel, I mean, I enjoyed it. It's inspired very much by the Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes style of mystery writing, and Gaston Leroux is pretty good at invoking this sense of really lavish opulence that the French opera conjures. And so having the kind of story about characters that go and watch the opera every single night to the point where they can have strong opinions on whether one singer is better than another, I think that's it's a fantasy that I'll never get to experience. And to think about the kind of lavish building that's being described here, that's full of secret tunnels and passageways, that has this underwater cistern that can house someone like the opera ghost, it reads to me a bit like a fantasy story. And I love that it's a book that's trying to preserve this moment in history and this kind of building. I also find it so funny that reading about English aristocracy, as I have done many, many times in my reading challenges, I always find myself not really sympathizing with the aristocrats, because I always think well, if I was in that historical context, I would never have been in this kind of landowning class. And yet when I read about French aristocracy or any other country's aristocracy, sometimes I just think oh, that's pretty fun. Those guys are rich. I don't know why, I just don't have that same sense of defamiliarization as I do with the English. I don't know. But this book is fun. It's a fun mystery. It's an interesting kind of subversion on the Beauty and the Beast narrative. So we have Christine Das, who is this very famous opera singer who, from a young age, was trained by this opera ghost in order to be a performer. She was, I guess, kind of chosen in this Beauty and the Beast type scenario where the opera ghost is protecting her, but he's this deformed figure who was born. It's not very clear exactly what he looks like, but he's born with this birth defect that meant society was very cruel to him. And I find it interesting as a sort of deconstruction, maybe not even intentionally so, but it just happens to be one, of the narrative of someone who's been betrayed by the world, and so they go on betraying others in turn. I think that usually when we think of this narrative, we have the outsider character achieve this sense of absolution. Like, they are still very desirable. They are still someone who has this magnetic presence to them. And this novel is not that. This novel, the opera ghost is just a monster. He's just a horrible person. And that's interesting in an odd way, because it makes me think about how, he's not in control of the circumstances of his birth, and it is absolutely wrong that society was so cruel to him that led him into this idea of spite and feeling like he could never be loved. And yet, that is not a justification for the behavior he takes in this book. It's interesting to think about. It's interesting to hypothesize, and it's interesting to think about my assumption about this story, having some awareness of it through just kind of knowing the story of the opera. I really thought that it was going to be a more straightforward Beauty and the Beast story. I thought it was one where Christine Das would fall in love. And instead, to present the opera ghost as a horrifying figure, as the original novel does, it's interesting. I'm surprised by how much empathy it gives to everyone other than the opera ghost, but I'm also not surprised at this more binary morality that it's trying to present. And analysis aside, is the actual mystery side of things fun? I think so. I think it's like a really rollicking adventure. It takes you not all around the world, but definitely all through Paris and all through this performance complex. And it does have characters from all sorts of different walks of life. I think that it is enjoyable, and it does have that entrancing nature that any good kind of mystery story should have. I'm genuinely thinking about re-recording this because I feel like I've spoiled it a bit too much, but also it's like a 100-year-old book, so I'm sure no one cares that much. Yeah, I just can't set aside that whole moral angle. Like, maybe I'm just the kind of person that can never enjoy a thriller anymore, because I just can't buy into a straightforward pureness of good, pureness of evil kind of story. It's fine. It's okay. I would give it a 3 out of 5. There are some scenes that were really memorable to me, and I think the creation of setting is this book's really strongest point. If I had to talk more about the relational angle between the opera ghost and Raoul and Christine Das, I don't know. I think there's like analysis to be made here that might go beyond what this original novel's intention is. I think the original novel's intention is just to be this really spicy and fast-paced mystery, and on those terms, it's fine. And lastly, Dyschronia by Jennifer Mills is an Australian novel. It is a possibly magic realist novel, and it's one of the best premises that I've described to anyone in recent memory. It is about the ocean disappearing in this small regional coastal Australian town, and a young girl who realizes that her dreams in that moment have actually been portent to the future, that she was able to see this before it actually happened, and thus people of the town start to view her as this way of planning out their future. So this is a novel that takes place over the course of maybe 30 or 40 years, and it's a great entry into the two timelines category, because the timeline is like one continuous narrative, and yet it constantly jumps back and forth. Every chapter is usually a different point in the timeline, and it's not structured in a way that makes it easy for you to figure it out. The whole point of this book is that you're experiencing time in a non-linear sense, in the same way that Sam does, where Sam sometimes can't tell between reality and the future or her dreams because of just how vivid they are. She has this feeling of experiencing two realities at the same time, and that's particularly vivid when she's at the same time and place. She will choose to go places and choose to do things in order to reenact or re-feel what she's had in her visions, because that creates this kind of resonance that gives her solace from the migraines she usually has because of just how complicated it is to experience time on these two scales. And this is not really a novel that rates very well. I think it has like a low 3 point something on Storygraph, and I wonder if it's because of how abrasive the structure is that it's not a book that wants to be understood very easily. Every chapter, you can imagine this. You can imagine every chapter could very easily have just had date year, and that could help the reader go, oh, this is the future, this is the past, this is where it's happening. And it's very deliberately not that. It's also very deliberately the starts of chapters don't orientate you on what's happening or where it's happening. And so, although we have characters returning, coming back and forth in Sam's life, we don't know what stage of it is until kind of a page or two into the chapter. And I think that's very deliberate. I think that feeling of being lost and having to figure out exactly where you are in the timeline is what makes this book really interesting. Because it's also, if I was to sequence the plot together and to describe what happens and what leads to one more thing, it doesn't have that straightforward, compelling quest structure that I feel like a lot of novels have. I mean, I read Neuromancer, I read Phantom of the Opera. Those are novels where A happens so that B happens so that C happens, and every time you go to a new chapter, you want to know what's going to happen next. And this is not the case here. Every time you finish a chapter, you have this lingering image, and the next one thrusts you somewhere else. And so the arc of this novel is really the reader trying to get a grasp of just what is happening. As you read more and more, you start to understand these characters more and more. You start to understand why certain pivotal moments and scenes in this book are the way they are. And that can be a very interesting experience, but it is so different from how you would normally view reading a novel. I think maybe I was lucky, because I was explaining this to a friend that I felt like I was reading this as a writer. I was reading this as someone who, if I thought to myself, how would I write a book like this? How would I write a book about a character who sees the future, or maybe she doesn't? And how would I write a book about the anguish of living in multiple timelines, of not knowing if the future is correct or not, or if you can trust your own perception of time or not? And the answer would definitely be to use this kind of unusual structure. And I think it's very, very successful in doing that. I think I totally am on board with what the author has done here. But it's something to be aware of before you jump into this. Like, it's not a book that is too difficult, but it's also not a book that you can just pick up on an afternoon and breeze through. It is a book that does take a little bit of effort to try and piece everything together. And when it's done, it makes me think that if I was to just read chronologically these chapters, it's not that compelling. I think what's really compelling is just the specialness of the structure, the specialness of the character, and that's valuable. That's really cool. That is something that I'm hoping to learn more about by reading books with two timelines, is how chronology can be used as an element of fiction to make things interesting, even when other things are not so much. And I think here, well, I don't want to denigrate the novel by saying that. I think this novel's got great characters, got an interesting core plotline, the setting's really well done, the writing style is really, really beautiful. It's so shimmery, and the impossibility of seeing the future and of experiencing multiple timelines at once. Like, this novel finds so many interesting metaphors to try and help you feel like what it might feel like, even though it's such an impossible thing. Like, all of this, I think, are really big positives, and I would give it a 4 out of 5. I think I learned a lot, and I thought about a lot from this book. But I think I come back to the fact that its strongest point is its use of chronology and its use of structure. And I think taking that away from it would be taking away the soul of this novel. That it would feel hollow, it would feel kind of missing something if we didn't have this experimentation with form. And that's admirable to me. That's something that you don't see very often, right? And I am someone that likes to work in realism. I am writing in completely linear styles, and I don't like playing with this. But sometimes it can be really remarkable when that does happen, and this is a great example of that. Okay, thank you so much for joining. This has been the Books of March. These categories I'm starting to really like, actually. So they are kind of hard to find books for, especially things like First Line Game and Rule of Cool, and thinking like, but what books will I actually read to fill that category? And yet, I'm glad that I'm moving away from the things that I've previously read. I'm glad that I'm starting to broaden out and read more contemporary things, read more things that structurally or conceptually interest me. I think that's really cool, and I'm looking forward to what next month will bring. Thank you for joining, and hope to see everyone soon.